Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Alex, and I'm the technical manager for this Learning Lab session today, which is comparing and converging indicators and addressing bias in the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or IPC. This session will be chaired by Scott, along with other hosts, including Jenny and Kaya. Thank you all for taking part in ANH 2024 this year. We're all looking forward to a robust and informative session today. I'd like to offer a quick reminder that if you need access to the conference materials or want to see the rest of the program, you can find this on the ANH Academy website. Before Scott and the team take the conversation forward, I have a few technical announcements to ensure that our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. First, this session will be recorded and posted to the ANH Academy website following the conference. You all have been muted for now, but please introduce yourself using the chat function to let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and what organization you're with right now. We encourage you to share your webcam video feed during the session, but if your internet connection is poor, we recommend turning your video off for a smooth experience. And if you have any questions, we invite you to share them during the chat box throughout the session for myself or other facilitators to answer. And lastly, if at any point you experience any technical difficulties, please check your audio settings and your internet connection, and you can always leave the session and reconnect using the same Zoom link to try to join again. If you have a specific technical question, please send me a private message using the chat box. So without further ado, I'll now turn it over to Scott to kick off this session.
Thanks very much, Alex. And yeah, I'm happy just to say very few things before handing over to my colleague Kaya. So welcome everyone. It really is very good to be back engaged with ANH, particularly with the Learning Labs. We were reflecting that this is possibly the fourth that we've been engaged for in a year. So very, very happy about that. The intention is very much to create an opportunity to get a sense, a glimpse of what the IPC is all about, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, and to really then draw people in to engage further, possibly even to do training and to become parts of analysis in due course. So we're going to talk a little bit about our approach generally, about some of the strengths and weaknesses in a range of indicators pertaining to food security, but more importantly, how we can use those indicators to help analyze acute food insecurity and its severity. And when we say analyze, it really means towards classifying an area of population. And essentially our approach of convergence helps us understand how different indicators can be brought together in a way that's very practical and very real. The way we're going to do it is Kaya's going to introduce, really give us a glimpse and a sense of what the IPC is all about. Yanni is going to take us into the heart of ultimately how we work with indicators, the convergence. And then Kaya again will really take us through in a rapid overview some of the key indicators that we use and as an indication of how to go much deeper. And then we've got this wonderful opportunity to then work with this in practice in terms of working groups, small groups that'll break away. We'll come back, we'll share, and ultimately we will hopefully have a great number of people wanting to engage much further. So thank you very, very much. So Kaya, over to you in terms of kicking us off. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Okay, let me first find the presentation. There, and I hope you see my screen. Okay, good. All right, so this is an introduction, a very short introduction to IPC, and I don't know if we introduced ourselves already, but so if not, my name is Kaija Korpi-Tammela. I'm the IPC Technical Development Team lead. Okay, so what IPC does and what it is it's a scale to classify acute insecurity, acute food insecurity, and chronic food insecurity, and acute malnutrition. So that's the ultimate aim of IPC. But it can be also characterized in many ways. So it's a process for building evidence-based technical consensus. So IPC is not done by one person sitting somewhere in a corner of a room. It's done in an open environment with different experts coming together and coming to a joint conclusion on the severity of food insecurity or malnutrition. It's also a path to provide actionable knowledge for strategic decision making. So we don't keep these analyses to ourselves, we release them, and then that informs decision making at different levels: local, country, regional, global level in terms of allocations for programming. It's also a platform to ensure rigorous and neutral analysis. We follow different protocols to guarantee that we view evidence in an unbiased manner. We take into account different opinions and different pieces of evidence. We follow certain analysis steps to ensure that the analysis is done according to the standards that we have established. It's also a partnership, including global, regional, and national partners. So at the global level, we have a partnership with 19 different food security and malnutrition agencies. At the regional level, the same people collaborate with each other, and agencies collaborate also with different regional institutions, etc. And then at national level, there are technical working groups, analysis teams that actually conduct the IPC analysis, involving all the relevant stakeholders at the local level. Okay, so how do we do the analysis? We take all these different pieces of evidence together, and we transform them into analysis products. So the end product of IPC is always an analysis brief that includes a map that tells you about the severity of the conditions in given analysis areas based on the scale that you see below, from phase 1 to phase 5. This is for acute food insecurity. And we also release population tables reflecting how many people are facing what kind of severity of food insecurity in those given areas. We have similar products, of course, for acute malnutrition and for chronic food insecurity. So for these three conditions, we produce these analysis reports for different countries. The IPC basically offers this type of information. So we answer the 6 key questions. How many people are food insecure? How severe is this situation? Why are people food insecure? Where is this happening? When is this happening? And who are these people who are facing food insecurity or are acutely malnourished, etc.? The when question responds to the needs of decision makers, knowing like when exactly is this happening. So we do analysis for current periods and we do analysis for projection periods. And occasionally we also do 2 projections to cover as long a period as possible. And the idea is that you can look at these findings over time and across space. So different countries have been doing IPC analysis, sometimes for 10, sometimes for 15 years, sometimes only for a few years, but they can look at the evolution of the situation over time. And then decision makers can also look at the situation over space. So they can see that these areas are particularly badly off, and they need more interventions than maybe some other areas that are not so poor in terms of acute food insecurity or acute malnutrition or chronic food insecurity. And they, at regional level, you can also kind of compare the countries to each other, although we don't generally recommend that. It's a lot more kind of reliable and worthwhile to look at the situation over time in a given country and severity across the scale and the time and space in a given country, because data collection methods that vary between countries and so forth. So they are not necessarily so comparable, but within a country, you can definitely do this kind of temporal analysis as well. Okay, and then IPC feeds different kinds of information products. So our results are released in global reports at country level, etc. We have an IPC website where you can get all the population estimates that we have done over the past X years through use of an API, etc. So all these IPC results are always available on the IPC website, but they are also then used to inform different policies, humanitarian programming, etc. In case of really high-profile crisis, the analysis results go all the way to the United Nations Security Council meetings. So yeah, they're used in different forms by different levels of decision makers. Here are basically the countries where IPC operates. So mostly, or the biggest number of countries is in Africa. In Western Africa, it's not the IPC as such, it's something called Quatre Harmonisés, which is very similar to IPC, but a kind of separate regional initiative. But the countries are also here. They have about 17 countries that they cover in Western Africa. So we have countries, a lot of countries in Africa, and actually this is now lacking. For example, Angola has IPC, etc. And then we have countries in Asia, And we have countries in Central America, so like Haiti, Guatemala, Honduras, etc. So, and Timor-Leste, I don't know if you can even see it here, but it's a tiny little island. Yeah, so we also do analysis there. So IPC operates in about 30 countries worldwide. And acute food insecurity scale is mostly implemented in these countries, and also depending on the acute malnutrition situation, also the acute malnutrition analysis. And in some countries, we've also been doing the chronic analysis. So this is basically the IPC in a nutshell. So, and in this session overall, we look at, as Scott was already mentioning, we look at the evidence and how do we use different pieces of evidence in the IPC. We review these indicators typically used for IPC analysis, and we have some proof work where we hope to discuss with you in more detail these different elements of food security and how do we actually assess them and what are the things we pay attention to when we do the analysis, and then hopefully we can come back together and have a bit of conversation on how do we put these different things together to actually come up with the kind of the final outcome of the analysis. I guess this was it. Over to Yanni.
Thanks, everyone. And I'm going to take over from Kai at this point, and I'll talk to you for about the next 20 minutes or so. My name is Yanni, and I'm the Learning and Research Coordinator for the IPC. And in that regard, I spend time trying to think about making sure that we're keeping track of what's happening in academia, and that we're equally that academia is informed by what we're doing. And in that capacity, we've had a good time working with the ANH over the past few years. So if you have anything, I'll put my contact in the chat later. If you have any academic level queries which you'd like to follow up on, just be in touch with me. And I'm humbled and touched by the fact that there are participants in this room who've been to previous sessions. I feel like on one hand, that's like a vote in our favor, that obviously we're very interesting. On the other hand, maybe it means you've been doing a really bad job and you didn't understand anything, so you had to come back to try to get it. So if that is you, my apologies, but but those of you who we're seeing for the second or third time, it's great to have you again. So as Kaya mentioned, one of the things that the IPC did, this was now 20 years ago that the IPC came into being and has been iterated on since then, was create a level of standardization in how food security is understood globally. And it seems odd to think of now, but there was a time where there really was no consensus as to what we meant when we said food insecurity or how that manifested. And one of the longer term innovations of the IPC has been to create a kind of standard approach to understanding and analyzing that. And that's what we've done. And this comes together at the conceptual level here. This is the integrated conceptual food security and nutrition framework, which effectively built from other conceptual frameworks, including the UNICEF malnutrition or nutrition framework, the Sustainable Livelihoods framework from DFID, and the pillars of food security that emerged from the World Food Summit 1996. This brought together a kind of notion as to how you would see outcomes manifest as a result of food insecurity. And in this case, we look both at food security and malnutrition, and this table brings it together. As Kaya referred to in her remarks, we have a number of different scales. We look at acute food insecurity, we look at chronic food insecurity, and we look at acute malnutrition. And what we're going to look at today is acute food insecurity. And this therefore brings us to one of the pieces of the conceptual framework, which is the analytical framework. There's going to be a lot of jargon coming at you, but all of it does cohere and make sense. So I hope that this will be consistent for you. But in any event, the analytical framework is this. This is basically the chain of events which leads to food security outcomes. And you interpret this diagram by starting in the top left quadrant, which shows you what the causal factors might be, which might result in complex food security outcomes, things including which are influenced by vulnerability, resources, controls. This manifests through livelihood strategies, the asset base, the policy environment, the economic environment, the environment itself, and so on, into which then at the bottom of that box, you then have acute events or conditions. So something happens, you have a tornado, conflict breaks out, so on. This corresponds then to impacts in food security below. You see the 4 pillars that are presumably well known to people on this call. So availability, access, utilization, and stability. That in turn then results in outcomes. And those outcomes are measured as food consumption or livelihood change. So you see changes in the way that people eat and what they eat, and changes in how they live to respond to those situations. Depending on the severity or the complexity of those first level outcomes, you then have second level outcomes manifesting in changes in nutritional status and mortality. Finally, the gray box at the top indicates that we recognize, and as part of the analytical framework, we acknowledge that there are other factors which influence nutrition and mortality beyond food and livelihood. And there's reference there to disease, water sanitation, and other factors which would have mortality and nutritional impact. And the other key thing to remember is that this although often ignored, is those two little gray arrows in the middle. The feedback loops are critical to what the IPC does, and that whatever outcomes, whatever second level outcomes you have will then impact again on what your vulnerability will be, and thus the cycle continues. And that's part of a critical element of our work, is recognizing that this is not like a finite endpoint, but is something that is continuing. So in order to get this into a usable way, into a way that it can then be applied at national level or at unit of analysis level, we try to work at the lowest level of disaggregation possible, is the analytical framework is then turned into something called the reference table. All of this is available in the technical manual, which looks like this, which is a free download if you go to the website, and is riveting reading. Everyone on this call had a hand in writing it. And so what you see therefore on the left-hand side of the reference table is those first and second level outcomes become the first column, with the contributing factors from your top left quadrant then at the bottom. So this then gives a tabular grid, which the analyst can then use to do some analysis of what's happening there. IPC expresses the process in phases. The IPC phases go from 1 to 5, 1 being basically food secure, up to phase 5, which is famine. So as you do an analysis, you make a judgment as to what phase the area that you're looking at may be in, and that can be phase 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so with those phases, that there's then a description of those phases, which says, okay, if you're in phase 2, this is roughly what you would expect to see. This is the situation for the people who are living there. And then the box below, and with the gray text, indicates what, therefore, in very broad terms, should be the response objectives for people hoping to support that situation. What should you do in the event that you are in phase 3 or similar? At the bottom, then, there's then these expressions of what indeed this would mean per phase, what is happening with each domain of indicators with food consumption. This is a sort of a generic statement as to what would be meant by being phase 3 for nutritional status. And this performs a kind of cross-check, so you can look and say, okay, well, if we've got this level of mortality, that means broadly we're in this region of the reference table, and therefore we're looking at a tentative phase 3 or whatever the case may be. And this just is a little synthesis, therefore, of what is included there. This provides, as it says, a general severity for each one of these brought together. All right. And so within each of these then, and this is what Kaya is going to speak about in a minute, for each of the indicators that is used, and that right-hand side of the analytical framework, where the outcomes are, we use direct indicators. These have been internationally agreed and painstakingly worked out, as indeed have the thresholds and the cutoffs for each one. So for each indicator, if you look there to the line which is first level outcomes, you'll see within the list of indicators that we use, and those indicators will have thresholds, so that if you're looking at RCSI, this is roughly the range of values you would expect for each phase. Now, we know, and everyone on this call will know, that food security is not necessarily diagnostic and mathematical. In other words, it's not simply a quantitative exercise of catching all the thresholds and then putting them into a calculator and spitting out an answer. There is a little bit of leeway, which is necessary because contexts are so deeply different and variable. And that's what we're going to talk about in the back end of this presentation this afternoon with the small groups, is how we converge this indicator, how we converge all the information we have. And that's why there's a bullet here to say the fact that the cutoffs are guides only. The indicators themselves, as you know, also food security indicators notoriously don't align with each other. They deviate and may contradict or may point in opposing directions. So part of that is also needs to be taken into account as you go through your analysis process. So those indicators that we look at for food consumption are these: dietary energy, HGDS, FCS, food consumption score, household hunger scores, RCSI, and HEA. I'll run a very quick informal poll in the chat. If you can guess which one of those is the hardest to find, please pop it in the chat. I'll respond in a minute. But those are basically the set to which then we look also at livelihood change. And for that, we have a general description here as to what may be found. And then equally what indicator we use, which is the livelihood coping strategy. And then at the bottom is the contributing factors. These are not, there are no thresholds for these. These are general because they're highly context specific. In some places, having a bicycle may indicate a household is well off. In another context, having a bicycle may indicate that household is poorly off. So the contributing factors have to therefore be contextualized, but they are divided into the 4 pillars of food security, and then also hazards and vulnerability per the Sustainable Livelihoods and Hazards and Vulnerability Framework from Sendai. Okay. Nutritional status, these again are globally standard. We use weight for height wherever possible, and MUAC where not. And then, but those can both be used in both contexts, as well as BMI. And finally, we have mortality data is expressed as either crude death rate or under 5 death rates. So that's what you need in order to get it together. But I think I'm going to pass back to Kaya now, and she's going to begin to talk us through what each one of these indicators can do and how we then bundle them together on the outcome side of the table, and what that means for an IPC classification. Kaya, back to you.
Thanks, Jenny. And I hope you can see my screen. Right. So these are the IPC indicators. And that's okay, yeah. So as Yanni already showed you a kind of image of the IPC acute food insecurity reference table here. It's maybe in a little bit bigger format, and as said, you can find it all with a lot more explanations in the IPC manual, which is available on the IPC website. So, and as he mentioned, the reference table includes something we call direct evidence. So we have all kinds of data on contributing factors, etc., that we also use for the analysis. But this is something, these are the indicators that are collected at household level for which different cutoffs have been established to separate the severity between different phases. And this is why we are calling them direct evidence, because we think that they inform us on those different outcomes we have in the analytical framework. And so for food consumption, we have actually quite a lot of different indicators. We have the dietary energy intake, which is the kind of a reference indicator for food consumption. We have HGDS, which is the household dietary diversity score. We have food consumption score. We have household hunger scale and reduced coping strategies index, and household economy analysis. And then finally, a relatively new entry, which is the food insecurity experience scale that was only included in the manual in 2021. So it's only been there for about 3 years. And then for livelihood change, we have currently only the livelihood coping strategies indicator, which is the WP indicator. We are actually currently working with partners trying to kind of come up with some new indicators that we could actually put for livelihood change in the reference table, given that we only have this one indicator and our livelihood change analysis is maybe not as good as it could be if we had a bit better understanding on that and more indicators to look into. Okay, so now I'm going to go through these indicators one by one, and hopefully this will all be relatively clear, although I have to do this quite quickly. So food consumption score is it's a relatively well-known, quite old indicator by WFP. It's their corporate indicator they are using for their own purposes, etc. But also lots of other agencies have adopted it, and they're collecting it frequently in different surveys. And here the idea is that all the food items are grouped into like 8 standard food groups. Then there are also condiments, etc., but those are not usually used. So actually, in most cases, like you see here, 10 food groups on the right-hand side in this table. Usually, though, the first 2 are grouped together into kind of cereals and tubers. So you treat them together as one food group. Then you look at animal protein, you look at vegetable protein, you look at vegetables and fruit, and dairy products and sugar and oils and fats. And indeed, condiments, those are not considered as part of the food consumption score when you actually do the calculations for that. Then, besides asking households what food groups did they eat, they are asked to also indicate how often they have been eating these over the past 7 days, and on how many days they've been having these different food groups. And different food groups have their own nutritional value-based score, which is allocated. So protein has the highest score, like 1. And then cereal has a score of 2. Vegetables have a score of 1, etc. And this is how you calculate the food consumption score. So you have cutoffs that are kind of based on the consumption frequency and the nutritional quality of those items. So between 0 and 28, or that can be poor food consumption. Then there's a borderline category, and then there's an acceptable category. However, these cutoffs vary slightly from one country to the next. So these cutoffs that you have here are for context where you have like high sugar and oil consumption. So that tends to mask otherwise poor consumption. And in countries where this is not the case, you use different cutoffs that start from 0 and go to 21 for food consumption, and then on for borderline acceptable. So this depends on the context. In Asia, we always use these higher cutoffs. In many countries in Africa, we use the lower cutoffs and so forth. So this is actually all coming from WFP. We just kind of use what they give us. Okay, and then there's the household dietary diversity score. And here the idea is that instead of having 8 food groups, there are 12 food groups. So there's a more detailed breakdown of different types of items. For example, eggs and fish are separate food groups, whereas for food consumption score, they're all lumped under the animal protein. And here you do make a difference between cereals and roots and tubers. In food consumption score, you actually put them together. So basically, the HDDS is a proxy measure of household food access. So how many household food items has the households had access to over the past 24 hours? That's the idea. So with the food consumption score, the recall period is 1 week. With HDDS, it's 1 day. And overall, the idea is that the more food groups households can access, the better their food security situation usually is, the more they consume in terms of different items and kilocalories and so forth. And then this is really simple. You just calculate the number of food groups the household had over the last 24 hours, and that's your score. So there is no special calculation, no weighting, nothing like that. It's just a simple score between 0 and 12. Reduced coping strategies index. So these 2 indicators we just looked at can measure what households consume over a certain time period. Then we have so-called experience-based indicators, which look at household experiences when they're trying to access food, or what do they do when they don't have, and how do they cope with these situations. So there are also these indicators. And one of them is the reduced coping strategies index, which was developed by WFP and CARE. And this is quite commonly collected also because it's very quick to collect. We only have 5 questions and the frequency options for them. So this is quite easy. It's often collected even in surveys that are conducted over phone. And here the question is, in the past 7 days, if there were these situations where you did not have enough food or minded by food, how often did you do the following? Do you, for example, borrow food or rely on help from friend or relative? Did you restrict consumption of adults so that you left more food for your children? Did you reduce the number of meals in a day, etc.? And these have a fixed severity scoring. And so then, for example, the restriction consumption by adults in order for small children to eat has the highest severity scoring because that behavior is considered quite severe. whereas relying on less preferred or less expensive foods is considered relatively low severity behavior. And then this, again, the score is calculated by adding up all these behaviors and the severity scoring over the past 7 days. And then this is the score is calculated with HHS. Is called the household hunger scale indicator, and this is another experience-based indicator. So it's actually the only one of these food consumption indicators that really tells us about the deficits that households experience in their food consumption. So this is a good indicator for estimating the severe end of food insecurity. So it has been validated for cross-cultural use. So it was previously a kind of longer questionnaire looking at different behaviors, and then they deducted it to 3 questions because these were kind of cross-culturally comparable. And again, this is there's a recall period of 30 days in this case, and then the severity is also based on how often did this happen over this period, and that's then how you calculate the score for a household. So the three questions on the severe that are included here is: was there ever no food to eat of any kind in your house? Was there ever a time over the last days? And how often did this happen? And did households have to go to sleep hungry because of lack of food? Or did the household member go a whole day or night without eating anything at all because there was not enough food? So these really measure food deficits, like when there are times when households really do not have food to eat. And then the severity of this is also defined by how often this happens over the course of the 30 days, and then the score is calculated based on that. Then we also have household economy analysis, which is a very different type of an indicator because it cannot be collected by sort of asking households certain questions, in a food security survey or phone. This is a very different type of analysis, and hopefully some of you are kind of more informative of this than I might be actually. And so it's a livelihood-based framework which is founded on the analysis of livelihoods and assets and shocks and coping capacity of households. So it's usually based on a baseline, like data collected over focus groups, key informants, etc., in a course of a certain amount of time in a given area. They establish livelihood zones based on this baseline information, and then using this information on the kind of the baseline capacity of households to meet their needs, they do something called outcome analysis, which includes new information on contributing factors such as prices and shocks and assistance levels and so forth. And then they produce this analysis saying that, okay, based on what we know about the baseline situation of these households and these new things that have come on top of that, how many households are experiencing food gaps. And that they have 2 thresholds. So there is a survival threshold that looks at really the food consumption kind of in terms of kilocalorie amount, and if households are able to meet this kilocalorie consumption threshold or not. And then there's a livelihood protection threshold. So looking at if households are able to kind of carry on their normal livelihoods, for example, buy seeds and tools in order to cultivate or buy fodder for the livestock or whatever that livelihood is that they're having. And then how, if they are able to actually keep on kind of investing or maintaining their livelihoods or not. Okay, so this is the HEA, and basically, if we have HEA information, we get these tables saying that this many households are facing these kinds of gaps. Either based on the livelihood protection deficits, or if situation is very bad, also going under the survival threshold. Then we have the food insecurity experience scale, and as I said, this is a kind of relatively new entry because these other indicators have been there for quite some time. So this is an FAO based indicator. So this is a kind of corporate indicator for FAO. And again, another experience-based indicator. So looking at the different experience of households and how severe those are. So there are like also questions on the anxiety. There's also kind of psychological issues that are measured by this indicator, unlike any other indicator. So the idea here is that households answer yes or no to these questions on the right. There are only 8 questions, so it's a relatively quick indicator again. And then there's a severity scale. And that starts from worrying about whether you have food or not. And then the severe end is actually experiencing hunger. And then the last three questions are basically the same questions as what we had in HHS. Remember those questions about running out of food, having nothing to eat in the households, going to sleep hungry, etc. So these three questions are basically the same. And so this is the kind of the severity scale. But in some contexts, it could be that, for example, question 2 is less severe than question 1. And if that's the case, the fear scale is able to adjust the severity of these items so that it actually places the households in a kind of opposite order. If the model-based analysis that fear does, it actually shows that this is the case. So this is kind of a dynamic module in the sense that the analysis is not fixed. Fear's analysis is done based on this brush model that can actually place the severity of the items slightly differently on that severity scale, depending on how things work in that particular context. Okay, so how do we use this? So as I said, the food consumption score and the household diversity score, they assess what the households eat. So we can look at the food groups and how often they are consumed, and we can kind of come to conclusions about-dietary issues based on these indicators. And then there are these experience-based indicators that look at the difficulties that households face when they are accessing food. And so these are useful for looking at different aspects of food insecurity. So, for example, RCSI is quite helpful in the early stages of a shock. So there is a shock that happened last week. How are households now responding to that? But when that shock has been there, for example, a conflict has been there for 2 years, households are no longer reducing the number of meals per day because they already did that earlier on. So RCSI is not that helpful for the kind of mature shocks or kind of protracted crises. And that's where I think other indicators such as HHS are probably more helpful because you can really look at this high-end severity with the HHS. So again, if the situation is relatively stable and the food insecurity is not very high, HHS is not very helpful. You are not going to have households who go to bed hungry every evening or who run out of food frequently in their households. So in those situations, we get very few results for HHS in the sense that, at the high end, we have almost no households whatsoever, and everybody's kind of packed into the lower end of the scale. So we have these differences in the indicators, and of course it makes convergence quite difficult because indicators might be telling us completely different stories. But on the other side, it's also very helpful because it helps us to understand different sides of food insecurity. So if we only had one indicator, we could only understand one aspect of food insecurity. But when we have multiple indicators, we can kind of build that story around them and see what's actually going on and what are households eating and what kind of difficulties are they experiencing and if there are any like really severe situations or not necessarily, and so forth. Then there's the livelihood coping strategies index. And this indicator looks at the strategies that households use when they cannot purchase food or income. And these are really livelihood-based questions, no longer did you have to cut back on your food consumption. We already captured that in the food consumption indicators. This is about other responses that households might do. And quite often when households face this kind of lack of money, for example, to buy food, they sell something. They sell some assets, they sell some livestock, they might sell something that they normally wouldn't, etc. Or they try to somehow make up ends meet by doubling down on efforts to get income in some ways that might or might not be sustainable in the long run. And this livelihood coping strategies index is trying to capture these aspects of food insecurity. So different strategies that households need to resort to when they're trying to make their ends meet. So, and one very common strategy, for example, is number 10 there, reduced expenditure on health. So households often in developing countries face all kinds of health problems, but they just maybe skip going to the doctor or to a health center because they need to save the money for something more important, like securing meals for their children. And so many of these things are quite commonly used, but then there are also strategies that are quite rare. Things like baking, that is quite an extreme strategy, or selling your house and land, because then that you are basically decimating your livelihood. So these are kind of so-called emergency strategies. We don't even have any examples here, but those are kind of reflective of the extreme end of the scale. And then we have the crisis strategies kind of in the middle that are negative for you. but maybe you can still somehow cope if the situation improves. And then the stress strategies that are like, okay, indicative of a stress situation, but are not so harmful as these crisis and especially the emergency strategies would be. Okay, so every time that the LCS is collected, we try to, or the people collecting this include at least 10 strategies: 4 stress, 3 crisis, and 3 emergency strategies. And then the household is placed in a appropriate category based on the most severe strategy that that household is using. So that's how the analysis of livelihood coping strategies is done. And as I said, we are together with different partners like WFP, REACH, and FuseNet, etc. We are developing, or these partners are also working on some potential new indicators to better understand livelihood change, and we are very much working together with them to hopefully be able to complement our reference table in a couple of years' time. Okay, this is it for the indicators. I hope you're kind of more or less still on time, and I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks very much, Kai. I think we've got some time for some questions for points of clarity in terms of the indicators before we launch into the small group work. So if there are questions in particular or anything to give more detail, please feel free.
Yanni, I think you didn't answer the question you posed. Maybe you should start with that.
I actually I did answer the question in the chat. The answer is
okay.
individual dietary energy, but thank you. I did answer that. The other point I wanted to make while we're meeting, and there was a couple of questions, Scott, coming through in the chat. Maybe you could take a look at those just while. I just wanted to add one thing, is that if you look at the final slide in Kai's presentation where it says thank you, see a whole list of logos across the bottom. And one thing to be aware of is the IPC is a partnership. It presently has 19 different organizations in it. And when all these indicators that we talk about, there are no IPC offices in any country, not really. We don't have data collection teams. All the data that we use comes from other sources. It's all publicly available, and it's all usually drawn from data that's collected from government, from WFP, from CARE, from FAO, from any part, UNICEF, all partners who are part of the initiative itself. So we use the data that's publicly available and that's produced by those partners, but we ourselves don't generate data. We have no data collection facility, just to be aware. So when we provide the analytical platform, but we don't collect the raw data ourselves. So thanks. Scott, was there anything in the chat of interest?
Yeah, we got at least 3, 4, 5 excellent questions. How does that sound? The first is, it's very striking. Is there anything that would be considered for urban contexts specifically? So that's an urban thing. We're going to get into that a little bit. I'm going to pose just 2 of the questions. And the second question from Rhino: in the Philippines, we frequently experience hurricanes and other natural disasters. I'm curious to know if there's a food resiliency index available. So one about urban, one about resilience and its relationship to food systems in particular. Thanks, Kai.
Okay, I can start and you guys can complement. So on the urban, as far as I'm aware, there are no specific indicators measuring food insecurity in the urban context, but IPC also does quite a lot of urban analysis. We do our urban analysis in like 17 IPC countries, not necessarily every time, but whenever there's data available or there's something of interest. So there are certain ways that you can try and kind of look at the situation in urban context differently. So for example, this livelihood coping strategies indicator, that can be adapted to urban contexts. And quite often, some of those strategies that are included there are not really relevant for urban areas anyway, like this emergent question of selling your house or land. Quite often, people living in urban areas don't own land, or they don't even own a house. So how would you actually sell them? Or things like selling your livestock. Like quite often, people living in urban areas don't have any livestock to begin with. So asking about these things is just really not helpful. So there are some efforts, and of course, this is very country specific, but for example, Afghanistan has been developing livelihood coping module specifically for urban context compared to rural context. So they just operate two different surveys effectively for urban areas compared to the rural areas. And they also then don't ask all these questions on agriculture, etc., for urban areas, or if they do, then they adapt the questions to the urban agriculture environment. Another indicator or a kind of example is the food consumption score, where there have been some efforts to develop questions specifically to capture foods consumed outside the house, given that in urban context, people often work somewhere outside the house, and they also consume food then outside. So at least in DRC and some other contexts, this has been done. So they try to include a separate module asking about households consuming foods or household members consuming foods outside their home. But it actually, when they announced the results, there was very little difference, compared to the normal food consumption score. So I guess it's always kind of big context specific as well, like how much do you need to look into that? And maybe some contexts it's helpful, in other contexts it's not. But yeah, as per separate indicators, I'm not really aware, but these commonly existing indicators are at least in some contexts being adapted to the urban context. Then on this household resiliency, food resilience index, yeah, I'm not really aware. When we developed the chronic scale, initially we tried to look at different resilience indicators, and if we could actually adapt something for the IPC chronic food insecurity analysis. And turned out that there was not a very good kind of common universal understanding on what resilience actually means. There was no joint definition for that. And every single agency had their own interpretation of resilience and their own indicator for resilience. And we end up in this conundrum that, okay, if we put one indicator in the reference table, we have to put 5, because all these partners had their own indicators. And of course, they would all advocate for their own indicators to be included. So we couldn't really agree. So finally, what we did with the chronic, we just put a placeholder text, something about this is how we expect kind of resilience to behave in these different levels of chronic food insecurity. And if you have any evidence and indicators on this, please use them in the analysis. So, but this was kind of the compromise we reached, because it was really difficult to come up with a specific indicator or specific definition, etc. And yeah, so that was a bit of a complication. But maybe Scott or Jari have more to say about this.
So thank you. Just on the resilience question, since we've had two points on that, very good points, and certainly for the participant who's coming from Philippines, absolutely, recurrent natural disasters are a major factor in resilience. I've put in the chat a link to, since this is ANH, to people who are well known to ANH. Stephen Dever and Chris Bene have written a textbook, in fact, indeed entitled "Food Security and Resilience." The entire book is free, and there's a number of chapters which are relevant to these queries. I do encourage you to look at it. Certainly chapter 1 and chapter 5 might service some of your questions, but it's really an excellent book throughout. And that, as Kaya alludes to, it's kind of a growth area. The interface, the conceptual interface between resilience and food security is something that is still very much a work in progress. For the IPC, as far as it goes, as Kaya says, there's no outcome indicators, but we do consider resilience in the top left quadrant of the analytical framework. So as you're going through the analysis process, if you are in a place that is seeing repeated natural disasters, then that certainly has an impact on those feedback loops that we talked about. And that would be something that you would take into account in the analysis, even if there isn't an indicator, a specific indicator, which pertains there. It'll maybe be in an ANH learning lab that we can do in maybe a year or 2 years' time, but we are also beginning to explore much more things around livelihood change, and how livelihood change might also include elements which are currently considered in the context of resilience, and what sort of this repeated exposure may do to that resilience. So I think very much a work in progress, but definitely keep it in the forefront of your thinking, and we'd like to hear from you on this. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. A couple of minutes. So we've got a few more. There's a question about indicators that account for seasonal differences. One of the working groups is going to look at that specifically, the whole concept of sort of these regular patterns or variations that are coupled with seasons, and just how sort of powerful they are to have that kind of analysis. But Kai, if you'd like to say something on that. There's also whether there are specific indicators around characteristics around indigenous community, for example, whether there are those that can differentiate. A question about how reliable is depending on a single past 24-hour record in determining HDDS. That's very interesting. So, and then a final question, which indicators would be ideal for assessing food security in non-emergency situations? I'm just going to put those out there, and if there's anything that you'd like to immediately react to, perhaps Yanni, you'd like to respond to the non-emergency question, Kaya, the others, and then I'm going to pull this to a close. Thanks.
So the seasonal differences, and as you probably saw, the recall periods are quite short for many of these indicators, and that's also just to account for the poor memory of people. It's just difficult to remember things like 3 months back and what exactly to consume, on those days, etc. So hence, like most of the recall periods are quite short, just to kind of increase the accuracy of the indicator. But then the idea is that you should do these surveys frequently. You should collect the data relatively frequently if you want to look at the seasonal variation in those indicators. And quite a lot of the monitoring is actually done. For example, RCSI, that Read Scope Insurgency Index, is really used for monitoring purposes often because it gives an indication, like rather quick indication when the situation starts to deteriorate, when how more people are doing food-based coping. So that's kind of a good monitoring indicator. And that's often collected kind of maybe not every month, but every couple of months to kind of monitor the situation. So that's how seasonality is accounted for, basically through monitoring. There's really no other way, at least with these indicators. Indigenous community. I don't know, again, if there are any specific indicators for that, but what you can do is just, do surveys that include that group of interest, and also collect data on that other group that is not of particular interest to you and compare their situation. So you could do, like we often in IPC, like if there's a household group that is a particular interest, like IDPs or refugee households, like we do separate analysis for them. And then when you put all these analysis results together, you can see how the IDP or refugee households, so for example, female-headed households, how are they compared to other population groups in the same areas or in the same country? And so that helps you to kind of provide information for decision-making in terms of, okay, are they worse off? Are they about the same? Do you need to use these special characteristics for targeting, or you have to maybe use something different? And this has been often the case, for example, with female-headed and male-headed households. So quite often you think that female-headed households might be like more vulnerable to food insecurity, but in many contexts, it's actually not that big of a difference. And maybe, at least when we have been doing this gender-sensitive analysis, that there's not often like a profound difference. They do different things. Their livelihoods are different. Their responses are different, like et cetera, et cetera. But at the ultimate outcome level, there might not be such a big difference. So then you might have to just find some other ways to target most vulnerable households, and maybe gender is not the thing that you should be most interested in, at least in some contexts. In another context, it could be actually the key thing. So this is always really kind of dependent on what the situation is, and kind of, but the only way to find out is to actually collect data and do analysis, and then So rather than just kind of have these preconceptions on, I know already, that these households are more vulnerable than others. So you actually need some evidence-based analysis to know that. I think there was also a question on the reliability of HDDS. And yeah, this is often raised as an issue that, okay, you're just looking at the last 24 hours. So how do you know? Of course, one option is, again, to do the monitoring, like collect the data relatively frequently. One thing that I think, so often in rural contexts, there's not a whole lot of difference. Like households tend to eat pretty much the same items on a day-to-day basis, with the exception of like maybe seasonal variation. Like this is the mango season, so we all eat mangoes every day, or this is the season for fishing, so we eat fish a lot, etc. But within these seasonal limits, like households tend to consume pretty much the same stuff. Like in Uganda, it would be matoke and peanut sauce and vegetables, like on a daily basis, right? Yeah, so then, but in urban environments, it probably does vary quite a bit more. So what you consume one day is probably going to be quite different from what you might consume in another day. And hence, there are a lot more questions asked about this in the urban environment. So maybe HDDS is not best for that. Or if you conduct it over time, you actually get a kind of better understanding on the patterns that households have. Okay, was this all from me? And then Yanni?
I think so. And I think this sets us up beautifully in terms of now going into the small group work, where some of these questions can become very real and really alive. So just to remind you, we're weighing up the evidence. And the opportunity now is that to get a chance just to let things go, to dive in, to look at a particular scenario with one of the facilitators, and to then consider what those indicators are telling us in terms of a story that's emerging. So it's giving us a sense of how we then work with data and evidence in order to then be able to work towards an analysis. So the way we're going to do this is that randomly, we're going to each be allocated to a small group. And there will be, as I mentioned, a scenario with each of the groups. And on return to plenary, somebody who's probably selected, hopefully volunteered, will provide a very brief explanation. So in other words, a little bit of feedback. And the groups will, at the beginning explain what they're doing. One will be looking at the use of contributing factors. So that's a term that we use, but ultimately bringing together economics, health, food security. That'll be run very ably by Yanni. I'm going to take a group looking at temporal aspects, so the whole issue of the scale of time and seasonality. And Kaio is going to look at livelihoods versus consumption. We're going to get into the groups very quickly, select a person for feedback, half an hour to work with the classification. Here it's going to be hopefully as messy as anything in terms of really getting stuck in. The person who's feeding back should be taking notes just so that they can check. And then we've got that opportunity for sort of rapid feedback at the end, where we're going to sort of really see what the stories are telling us and learn from each other, and possibly even give an indication of, if we were looking at that particular place, could we classify it? What would it be telling us about the classification? So that's really where we're at in terms of the plan. Alex, if I could turn to you, if you could perhaps push us all into these different groups, just with Kaya and myself and Yanni sort of anchoring each of them, if that's okay. Thanks very much. Yeah. We've got small group work now in terms of feedback, and Talia, Yanni, I'm going to really encourage you to carry on that conversation in terms of just the insights there. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes for each group just to feedback based on the questions that we followed, the kind of discussion. We all selected or someone volunteered in terms of a rapporteur. And essentially, it's just a chance for us to get a glimpse of what the other groups are dealing with. My sense is that if we could speak briefly, have a little bit of a conversation in what the time we've got allocated, as opposed to long discussions or long explanations, it would just make it a little bit more interactive. So Yanni, I'm going to turn to you. Is there somebody who's going to be speaking on behalf of your group?
Thank you, Scott. I'm deeply hopeful that Anjali will take up the awesome responsibility. Anjali, can I count on you? Over.
Let me try, because this data was really difficult to understand. It was like a bouncer. Just 2 hours of electricity, 75% not having insurance. It was very difficult to understand, and the population seems to be going through a very difficult situation. Is either natural or man-created, human-created situation. And we found that there was lack of data. It was highly dependent. The survival was highly dependent on import from other countries, especially for especially for basic food and other requirements. There was no health or related situation which was in control. So the population seems to be going through disaster, and there is huge lack of data which is available, especially about the socioeconomic conditions or the consumption data or livelihood information. The data seems to be lacking to make any inferences, but this is my understanding of. So we suggest that we might require all the 4 indicators to be measured, which they have suggested, and there is huge inflation affected malnutrition, like and things that are going on in this population. We couldn't predict much, like because of my understanding, I can say only this much. But anybody from the group wants to add something, please go ahead.
Bryn, would you like to add anything to those excellent summaries that Angela has provided?
Yeah, I'm also struggling quite a bit here. So I think we didn't have real malnutrition kind of data, nor real dietary data. So that was at least something that I don't know, I would have wished for. I have to say I've got a nutrition background there, so maybe I'm a little bit biased. Yes, we were told that other people had that lower down in the presentation. But for us, that was quite difficult. And yeah, this like the import dependency ratio, which you explained, if it's 1, then everything is imported of certain kind of food items that one is calculated for, was like nearly 1 for some key staples, wheat and cereals and sunflower oil. So that's, I don't know, yeah, that's a very serious kind of thing. And yeah, Anjali, I think you highlighted that one already. I don't know what else to mention. Yeah, the population seems to be quite suffering for a lot in terms of like other indicators, health and certain basic indicators there.
Thank you very much. And the group, I'm delighted to say the group did, Scott, come up with a potentially indicative phase classification, but I'm going to hold fire on that until we've heard from the other groups. Over.
Kenny, thank you very much. Oh, and thanks very much to that group. Really very important, interesting. Our group dealt with the temporal aspects and in particular in seasonality. Rino, I'm going to ask you just to feedback and to draw on the others to give a bit more detail. Got a couple of minutes. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much. So, throughout the discussion is we identify the different complex issues, complex issue that fluctuates over time and influence in the various temporal factors. So, for example, a seasonal calendar that illustrates to the different harvest, no, or harvest, sowing, and growing to different types of agricultural commodities, which it provides a certain kind of insights on how these different patterns or periods that affects the food availability and access of agricultural commodity to the community. But over time, during our discussion is we identified key components in the seasonal, seasonal or time components of this, not only in the agricultural harvest, but also in the school year, religious events such as our Ramadan and different types of religion, and also a major shocks like COVID-19 and the war of Russia and Ukraine. So providing or expounding these components is it really gives us a certain kind of perspective in how our decisions or how does we implement certain kind of initiatives in this time inference, I mean temporal and seasonal situations. So maybe I would expound a little further. For example, one of our participants indicated the war of Russia and Ukraine, which affects the fertilizer, fertilizer supply, not only in fertilizer, but also the grain supplies in major exporters. So this war has led to a various higher food prices and shortages, which affecting various countries and heavily reliant to the imported fertilizers and grains. And by that is we are also uh, putting out in the urban situation in the rural situations, which is we are tackling also the peak and lean season, and also, for example, peak and lean season, and I'm sorry, and the other influences. If correct me if I'm wrong. So by that is this really affects us. As Scott also indicated, that we have to really identify the analysis or the gaps of the analysis, and bringing the time in the season towards our analysis, in our analysis, to analysis in addressing certain kinds of decision and decision and uh, decision analysis when it comes to the food insecurity. So
Thank you. Spot on. Really pulled together such a lengthy discussion into such clear. I'm going to call you in terms of your wonderful thinking around globalization and urban contexts. Any reflections from you, just to add to what Reno shared with us, just in terms of the evidence we're looking at, and the point you made just in terms of food markets and the importance in terms of a response in that urban context? Anything of that nature?
Yeah, when I was first thinking, like when I usually thought of seasonality, I always thought about the agricultural seasonality and the, seasons, like the natural seasons, and the lean periods. But thinking about like when we talked about like different kind of like, seasonality and lean periods in the urban context, it was pretty interesting to talk about like, especially like if there are any they're both like domestic as well as external what you may call I'm forgetting the word, the external can you help me?
Factors that are external factors influencing that particular food
yes
system.
Yes. So yeah. Domestic could be anything like if because of climate change, there's a pest infestation, so domestic production declines. So people will have food shortages, which they might meet from like by purchasing it in the market. And there are also like there may be market shocks because of various global events that we faced, like COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war, and even like very local elections in India or something like that. So that could also affect food prices in developing or in any place.
You're looking at the interconnections in terms of the global food economy and just placing that so clearly in context in terms of this particular place we looked at. Really appreciated that. So it's a lot that our group got through. Just to say thank you very much. Kaya, over to you in terms of some reflections from your team.
Thank you. And of course, we were talking about the indicators all this time, and we did not have a conversation on who would present. I'm very sorry. So I have to just allocate responsibilities here. So Denise or Vanessa, would you, either one of you, please say something about our conversations and maybe not the conclusions, we are saving that for later in terms of the phases, but anything you remember about our conversations on the indicators, and then the other one can also contribute. Yeah, Denise, please go ahead. Thank you.
Sure. Hope you can hear me all right. Honestly, it was a steep learning curve. I won't speak for the others, but I know I was still trying to remember which indicator was what and try to think it through. And I'm just looking at my notes here. Yeah, so like with the first data that we had, I think we could we tried to interpret and analyze it a bit, and it was difficult. But then with the with the second data, and I want to call what it was the MVAM. So that kind of gave us a lot more background information, it felt like, to have a better understanding of what was going on in terms of the coping strategies. And then it was really interesting at the end when we did kind of, I think, that optional part about how when Kai explained how you determine the population for each phase. So I'll let maybe Vanessa fill in the blanks there. If you have something to add, please. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great, Denise. I would just add, well, first, I'm starting to feel the pain of the IPC committee in trying to decipher all this data that conflicts each other and come to some conclusions. So we had 6 or 7 different indicators from 2 different surveys, so at different times. And so we were looking at FCS, RCSI, HHS, and LCSI, and they all kind of told a different story. And so it was a matter of triangulating each of those stories with each other and coming to a conclusion, very, very much an estimate of the IPC phase. And I don't know about others, but I'm still kind of not super confident about where we landed, but it was very eye-opening to see the challenge of deciding on the IPC phase together, but can understand why it takes lots of conversation. Yeah, and then the 2 different surveys, one was face-to-face and the other was a CATI. So, you know, taking into account the different methodologies that were used. Yeah, and like Denise mentioned, then learning how to assign population proportions to each of the phases was quite interesting as well.
It's just to say that we were not really supposed to do the population estimates, but somebody asked this question, can we look at how we actually estimate population across phase? So we started that. We didn't quite finish, but we kind of went through the principles of how you would go about that and kind of conversations that.
Just wondering if maybe Mireille might have something to add.
Please, Denise.
Okay, if I'm just on my side, because we had 2, like as the fellow groups members share, we had 2 different surveys, the survey 1 and 2, taken at, we don't know exactly whether it was a different time, but it was clear that there was no convergence between those 2 surveys. And we reached the conclusion it could have been because of the different time, or even the survey 1 being face-to-face and the other one was done using computer generated. So that would have affected the different results. And also all the indicators, they were not converging among themselves. But what I appreciated is that we had a bit of background with regard to the coping strategies, as we saw that some of the participants employed coping strategies such as reducing medical expenditures, also reducing expenditures on education. So that helped us see that there was really, they were engaging in coping strategies. So based on that, it was easy to start looking at the classification phase. And we kind of hinted that it could be mostly on classification stage, phase 3 in terms, in general, as that's help us converge into that regard. And although the other, also there was the RCSI, which could also help us converge into that regard, looking at the livelihood coping strategies. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really great. And very clearly the group worked at the end towards that rapid classification. And as I understand it, Kaya, phase 3 is what emerged. Really, really great. Thank you for that. And clearly it's a group that was not only making sense with a lot of the data and the indicators, but were rapidly able to move towards that classification, which I think is really important. The real power of IPC is when you get stuck into these analyses and you actually really grapple with weighing up that evidence to move to that. Yanni, to draw you in, because your group also worked towards classification.
We did, and it was indicative only. I think, bearing in mind that our group was dealing with really macro level data in terms of both imports and the overall public health picture. So, nevertheless, based on the data, we had no direct indicators, and as Gudrun said, they felt the lack, shall we say? But nevertheless, with that, there was a sense that there were two votes or two kind of opinions. One was probably phase 4. And then the other one was higher than 3. So I think if our group proposes a 3/4, and what we just heard from the group that Kaya was part of is also looking probably at a phase 3, then I think perhaps we're beginning to get a sense of the possible consensus here. I've included in the chat, it's a few messages up now, just a little a screenshot of what the 5 phases represent. And if anyone needs to be reminded of what those are, then that's in the chat. Feel free to just click open the graphic, and you should remember what those 5 phases are. But yeah, so 3 or 4, I think, Scott.
Thank you, Yanni. And if you could just repost that would be great. Just to all, that would be really wonderful. Thank you for that. So our group didn't get to that. We were already wondering about the temporal aspects of the time, that moment that we needed to classify. We didn't quite get to, but my sense was that the group was pretty much moving towards a 3, but that's completely my imposition without any form of reaching consensus. So I'm just going to be very careful of that. Just to open it also, Kaya, Yanni, any reflections in terms of what emerged with some of your discussions? Anything in terms of relating directly to your particular topics as we just move towards wrapping up?
I mean, I think the one thing that was striking in our group, and I think the initial reaction to our group was that people weren't economists, and they felt some reticence about analyzing data which was not in their field of expertise. And I wondered if Kaya or Scott, you had other reflections on how, when you're in an IPC process, you do end up having to parse data which might or might not be in your wheelhouse, and how do you deal with that? What's a good way to address the fact that you need to skill up very rapidly on what the import dependency ratios mean? How do you deal with data that you're not familiar with in these analysis processes?
Well, yeah, no, I kind of agree with Yanni. I think also our group was a bit, kind of a bit overwhelmed, especially in the beginning. Like, you just have this table with like these values and indicators with like acronyms, and it's kind of like, my God, like, how am I gonna make sense out of all that? So we just kind of went through, talked about these indicators again, like, okay, what do they actually might mean, in terms of like what can we get out of that? And of course, it would have been helpful, and I think we made the point many times, to have a bit more stuff, like, okay, for example, for the food consumption score, like, what are the actual food groups that households consume? In actual real life, analysts do have that information, but in this simulated exercise, we didn't have all those details. And also on the sampling and that time data collection for those surveys, like, we didn't have that. In actual analysis, we would have that, and we would be used to kind of make sense of that data, and if there has been evolution. One interesting thing that came out, that was that, okay, that, if indeed that kind of temporal aspect, that because now these two surveys are telling us different things. So maybe there's a seasonal evolution or some kind of evolution in the situation if one has been collected earlier and one later. But because we didn't know which one might have been collected earlier or later, like, we couldn't really take that so much into consideration. But that's definitely an interesting aspect that came out from those conversations.
Thanks, Kaya, and a great question, Yanni. So very similar in terms of the way the story was set up at the beginning. Very deliberately, we were moving towards a rural seasonality, and then suddenly we brought in the context that it was actually an urban context with the population over 90% urbanized. And I think, Agatha, you really summed it up. You said, you were going into a rural place. You were understanding seasonality in terms of production, but suddenly had to switch your assumptions in terms of looking then into a deep urban area. At Chiamo, you had a very similar reaction in terms of your own place, thinking about the challenges of seasonality had more of a direct impact on availability and access for those producers and growers. Of course, also the urban context, but it was very different to the place in which we were looking at, that was so embedded into an urban context, reliant on import-export markets with connections to places like Ukraine and elsewhere. And so I think context matters, and we've also got to question our assumptions. take our assumptions and make sure we are thinking about those. Colleagues, we've got 5 minutes. I'm just saying there is a form, a wonderful, wonderful form to engage with. It's in the chat. At the end, there's a real surprise for you if you accurately complete it. There's a wonderful reward. It's in terms of how you feel having completed something wonderful. Please do take a bit of time to do that. But any final thoughts or comments from anyone in terms of what you've learned, your sense of IPC? Is this something you would like to do, to continue with? Anyone like to just venture an opinion? Kaya, yes.
Yeah, no, sorry, I realized I didn't answer the question of Yanni about, okay, what do you do with these import-export files and whatnot? But so one of the key things in IPC is that you bring together different expertise from different sectors, and then, somebody knows what pieces of evidence are all about, and another person can actually interpret the acute nutrition data that we have and so forth. So the key is to bring together all these different experts. And every now and then we also have these kind of sessions in the beginning of the analysis, like actually walking people through, for example, price projections or something like that, that requires special expertise. But then it's kind of explained to everybody what this data says and whatnot. So that's kind of the way. But not everybody has to be an expert in everything. We try to ensure that there are experts coming together so they can all inform each other.
Thanks, Kaya. Very apt. Any final comments from anyone? Any last thoughts before we wrap this up absolutely on time? So
I'd be curious to attend one of these meetings actually at some stage. Like it seems to me like it's a crazy amount of data with loads of gaps probably all the time, and you have to make up your mind and do the best possible to judge the situation and kind of come up with that phase. So yeah, haven't had a chance yet to do that or actually time to join one of these processes. I know they're all over, but probably it would be very interesting to observe that at some stage.
Well, Gudrun, I'm delighted to announce that since you're in Uganda, there is a major exercise happening in Uganda later this year. And if possible, it would be, especially with nutrition profile, you're ideally placed to get involved in something very large and very complicated. The Uganda malnutrition analysis will cover the entire country for the first time.
Okay, very interesting. Okay.
Previous analyses have covered only Karamoja and the north. So the fact that there is now a big one coming. So watch this space and definitely stay in touch with us if no one else, or with your colleagues in Uganda. But yes, I see no reason why you not embark on that journey.
Time would be a reason. But anyway, thanks. Very, very exciting to hear.
Thank you, Gudrun, and good luck. Kaya?
Maybe to say that there's a calendar on the IPC website that actually, publicly tells you whenever there is an IPC analysis or training happening and which countries those are within a span of a few months. So whenever we know like relatively accurate dates for an activity in a country, it's put in the IPC calendar. So you just find it on the IPC website. And then there are always like, contact this person if you're interested, blah, blah, blah. So or you can just contact us and we put you in touch with the right people.
That's a wonderful way to end. As we reach the last minutes, that survey hasn't yet been completed by everyone, but it's there if you so wish. And I think we can really just close it with Kaya's last comments in terms of that the website's there, that's the interface, that the three of us are willing and able. We have a long-standing relationship with Talia and Alex and the others from ANH. Very grateful for the partnership and the collaboration, and we hope that too we will go from strength to strength and see you all very, very soon. Yanni and Kaya, thank you both very much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks everyone so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.